and to begin to negotiate with Kurdish forces in Syria to bring an end to the violence.
Vice President Pence says he and National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien will soon travel to Turkey for meetings with President Erdogan. The White House also imposing economic sanctions and doubling the tariffs on steel imported from Turkey. Murder charges have been filed against a Fort Worth, Texas police officer, Aaron Dean, for the shooting death of a woman he'd been sent to check to make sure was okay.
Dean walking around the outside of the home with a flashlight and his gun. He never identifies himself, and when he gets to a back window and sees someone inside, he tells them to put their hands up before shooting them.
That's Fox's Garrett Tenney, who reports 28-year-old Tatiana Jefferson was dead at the scene. Demonstrators marching in Fort Worth Monday evening. Officer Dean resigned hours before he was arrested. He's been freed on $20,000 bond and wearing a monitoring device. Fire investigators haven't yet determined how that big L.A. area wildfire started last week, but they know where. It was underneath power lines on a steep, dry hillside above Saddle Ridge, California. Some people say they saw the wires sparking. Southern California Edison also reported a problem with its power lines in that area at the time. That fire destroyed 17 homes, charred 13 square miles. One man died during the fire of a heart attack. Wall Street closing Monday lower, the Dow dropping 29 points, NASDAQ down 8, the S&P 500 closing off 4 points. America is listening to Fox News.
Did you know that home loan rates have plunged again? Would you like to take advantage of these lower rates to help lower your monthly payments? Refinancing doesn't have to be for another 30 years. It can be for 10, 15, or 20 years. It's up to you. Reduce your monthly payments. Pay off your loan earlier. At Bank Pacific, where we're open to closing your loan in a hurry.
Bank Pacific, where others put branches, we place roots.
Equal housing lender. Credit conditions apply.
Mezcla Chamorro Fusion Bistro brings you island hospitality with a true taste of modern Chamorro cuisine. A bistro look that feels like home. Their menu features local and traditional flavors with a twist. From their famous Calaguan Hafa to fresh ahi poke salad and their award-winning barbecue ribs. Mezcla takes your favorite local dishes and serves them with extra flair that you'll only find at Mezcla Chamorro Fusion Bistro. Stop by their newest location in the Grand Plaza Hotel in Tumon. For reservations, call 969-2652. Mezcla, a true taste of Guam.
A published report says the former national security advisor is among those who were concerned about President Trump's contacts with Ukraine.
Former national security advisor John Bolton was reportedly so concerned about possible efforts to pressure Ukraine for political help that he told Fiona Hill to notify White House lawyers. According to the New York Times, Bolton said, quote, Giuliani's a hand grenade who's going to blow everybody up. Hill is the former senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs who spent 10 hours in closed-door testimony Monday telling lawmakers that she confronted top Trump administration officials about the activities of President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani. But Giuliani denies any wrongdoing, telling Fox News his contact with Ukrainian officials was set up with the State Department. In Washington, Sean Lanchel, Fox News.
In the continuing congressional investigation of the president, a former top assistant to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been called to testify to congressional committees on Wednesday. It is not clear whether Michael McKinley will appear. The Democrats who'd like to be president gathering in Columbus, Ohio for Tuesday night's debate as a new poll is released.
Biden's favorability rating in a new Quinnipiac poll is higher than Sanders or Warren, but it's his lowest in 5 years. And if the former VP cannot right the ship, CNBC reports Michael Bloomberg might reconsider his decision to stay out of the race and run as a Democrat. In Columbus, Ohio, Peter Ducey, Fox News.
12 of the Democrats' candidates have qualified for the debate at Otterbein University outside Columbus. Negotiators for General Motors and its striking UAW workers talked well into the evening on Monday. That strike by 49,000 GM workers will reach the 30-day mark on Tuesday. There are some signs of progress. Now, 53 people known dead, at least 20 others missing in Japan in the wake of Typhoon Hagibis, as according to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. I'm Jack Callahan. This is Fox News.
Family Finance has been serving the people of Guam since 1959, and they'll continue to be there for you in the years to come. Whether you're looking to get a personal loan for that summer vacation or paying off those long overdue bills, Family Finance has got you covered. Apply for a personal loan from $1,000 up to $3,600 by calling Family Finance in Agutya at 475-4545, Upper Tumon at 647-5626, or in Dededo, 633-4473. Family Finance, serving the people of Guam since 1959.
Hulu is all your TV in one place, plus more. Watch thousands of hit shows, movies, and award-winning Hulu originals for only $5.99 per month. It's TV without the cable contract and the freedom of on-demand streaming. Get current network shows from ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, and binge watch every season of your favorite cable shows. Premium Hulu viewing is brought to you by Proline Automotive and AB Sports, Guam's store for Nike. To advertise on Hulu, call Choice Digital at 989-0042.
Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie is brought to you by Bank Pacific. Banking on the Pacific for 65 years.
Welcome to Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie, the only show on talk radio where common sense is a lot more common. Phone lines are now open at 888-TALK. That's 888-8255. And now, The Point proudly brings you Tall Tales with Senator Bob Klitzkie.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We start the program that way every day. It's important because it's part of our Constitution, part of our rule of law here, that makes Guam such a wonderful place to live. As is my usual custom, I've got a couple of squibs here to read dealing with the Second Amendment, and one of them contrasts a couple of rights that I think are very important: private property and the right to keep arms, and the right to bear arms. And I've explained the difference between keeping arms and bearing arms on more than one occasion, mentioning that the two Supreme Court cases, Saylor versus District of Columbia and McDonald versus Chicago, hold that a citizen, as you were a person, also known as they, have a right to keep firearms in their house for self-protection. But the Supreme Court hasn't spoken to the question of whether or not a person has that same right to bear arms outside of his dwelling. It appears that the Supreme Court is poised to make a decision on that particular matter during the current session of the Supreme Court. The case I want to deal with right now is a case that arose in Georgia. The Georgia Supreme Court kicks Botanical Garden case back to lower court. And here's how it goes. This one comes from Bearing Arms, that website that I go to quite often for firearms articles. And here's what the guy says, Tom Knighton. While I consider myself a staunch supporter of gun rights, I also support property rights just as vehemently. And well, he should, because the right to own property, private property, is so essential to freedom that it's right up there with the right to keep and bear arms. We wouldn't have the capitalist free society that we have if we didn't have the right to private property. That's what distinguishes capitalism from socialism. Socialism, the state controls the means of production and distribution. In a capitalist society, although there are some exceptions, private parties control the factors of production and distribution. So Tom says, while I consider myself a staunch supporter of gun rights, I also support property rights just as vehemently. I think people have a right to do what they want to with their own property, even if I think they're stupid for doing so. This becomes an issue for me when property rights butt straight into gun rights, such as gun-free zones in states where private property owners can make their own determination on the issue. In my home state of Georgia, however, things are a little weird. Private property owners can restrict guns on their property, but a gun-free zone sign has no force of law. Further, as a preemption state, communities can't pass their own gun control regulations. Now, what is meant by the term preemption? By the way, Real Joe Cruz, you better turn on the Law and Order notebook sound there, huh? Little bit of legal terminology here. A preemption state is one where a state can make laws that preempt a local government's ability to legislate in the same area. In other words, in Georgia, if the state makes the laws concerning guns, not the cities and counties. It's not that way in every state. Every state's a little bit different. As a preemption state, Georgia as a preemption state, communities can't pass their own gun control regulations. Why do these two things have anything to do with one another, property rights and gun rights? Well, there's a case where the Atlanta Botanical Gardens said they can restrict guns on their premises because they're a private entity. The problem, though, is that the property itself is owned by the city. Now, the state Supreme Court has kicked the case back down to the lower court. In 2014, a member of a gun rights organization called GeorgiaCarry.org filed suit in Fulton County Superior Court seeking to overturn the nonprofit organization's firearms ban. So in other words, in 2014, if you wanted to go to the Atlanta Botanical Garden, you would see a sign at the gate of the Botanical Garden that says, if you own any guns, get the hell out of here. We don't want you in here. Atlanta Botanical Garden countered, so a suit was brought on that, and Atlanta Botanical Garden countered by citing language in state law that allows owners of private property to prohibit firearms from being brought onto their property. So if I owned a radio station in Georgia and I didn't want anybody traipsing in with firearms, I could say no guns allowed in station WBOB. Right, Real Joe Cruz?
Yes, sir.
And that would be protected by the state law. But this botanical garden matter is actually public property because it's owned by the city of Atlanta and leased to the organization that operates the facility. In 2016, the justices sent it back to the trial court. The Fulton County Court then ruled in favor of Atlanta Botanical Garden for the second time. The Georgia Court of Appeals upheld that decision. In Monday's ruling, the Georgia State Supreme Court declared the Court of Appeals should not have dismissed the lawsuit by summary judgment rather than considering the merits of the case. At the heart of the issue appears to be the fact that the lease between the city and the garden wasn't part of the official record. Some technicalities here. An appellate court is not going to rule on a question that's not raised in the record of the court below from which the appeal came. Much of this actually hinges on the wording of that issue. Now, will it make a difference? Speaking as someone who is not a lawyer, Tom Knighton is not a lawyer, and has never played one on TV, I am not sure that it will. While the property itself may be publicly owned, the lease probably does make it so that it's considered public property for the purposes of determining what's permissible on the premises and what isn't. Maybe. Then again, it may not. I haven't seen the lease, so I could be very wrong. Honestly, I hope I am. I just wouldn't hold my breath on it. However, there's another reason why the lawsuit like this matters. Over the years, GeorgiaCarry.org has had issues with the city of Atlanta trying to issue gun control pertaining to city property. In particular, I recall them trying to ban guns in a city park. It's important to note that as such, GeorgiaCarry.org's lawsuit may serve as a reminder that the state's largest gun group isn't willing to just let them slide by in their decisions to ignore the state's preemption law. Instead, it will be fought and fought vigorously as it should be. So an interesting question here. Property rights. If I own Blackacre as I would value my own property rights, if I don't want anybody coming on my property with a gun, I should be able to say, you can't come on Blackacre if you got a gun. And, you know, in 1965, we went to the Federal Accommodations Act. Up until that time, the right of a property owner to dictate who could and couldn't come on his property was almost absolute. We've made some inroads into that now. But as much as I am pro-gun, I would still assert a property owner's right to ban guns from his own private property. Okay, I'm going to read one more here because I'm going to be gone for a little while and I won't be doing the Second Amendment part of the show. I know Daryl will do a really good job, but this one is so important that I want to leave it with you before I leave. And it counters the arguments of the anti-gunners. That's why one reason I think it's so important. You know, the anti-gunners, the left, those folks out there in the Democrat Party who would take away all of the guns, folks like almost all the Democrat candidates, because they think that by doing so they could have an effect on what they call mass shootings. So they think that if they would just outlaw assault weapons and buy back assault weapons, we could move on to kind of a utopia where no one ever got shot. Facts don't bear them out, but when did facts ever make any difference to Democrats? So this is a program, an article that written by Dennis Prager, a good conservative. He says, why so many mass shootings? Ask the right questions and you might find out. This past weekend, Americans learned of another mass shooting, this time by an employee who decided to murder as many people as he had worked with for years as possible. As of this writing, the murder toll is 12. Every American asks, what was the killer's motive? When we read, there is no motive, we are frustrated. Human beings want to make sense of life, especially evil. Liberals, in this regard, liberal views are essentially the same as leftists, are virtually united in ascribing these shootings to guns. Just this past weekend, in a speech in Brazil, former President Barack Obama told an audience, our gun laws in the United States don't make much sense. Anybody can buy any weapon anytime without much, if any, regulation. They can buy guns over the internet. They can buy machine guns. That the former president fabricated a series of falsehoods about the United States and maligned on foreign soil the country that twice elected him president speaks to his character and to the character of the American news media that have been completely silent about these falsehoods. But the main point here is that, like other liberals and leftists, when Obama addresses the subject of mass shootings in Brazil, he has been talking about the children murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary in 2012. He talks about guns. Yet America had plenty of guns when mass murder rate was much lower. Grant Dewey, a PhD in criminology and director of research and evaluation at the Minnesota Department of Corrections, gathered data going back 100 years in his 2007 book, quote, Mass Murder in the United States, A History. Dewey's data reveal in the 20th century, every decade before the 1970s had fewer than 10 mass public shootings. In the 1950s, for example, there was one mass shooting. And then a steep rise. In the 60s, there were 6. In the 70s, the number rose to 13. In the 80s, the number increased 2.5 times to 32. And it rose again in the 90s to 42. As for this century, the New York Times reported in 2014 that according to the FBI, mass shootings have risen drastically in the past half dozen years. Given the same ubiquity of guns, wouldn't the most productive question be what, if anything, has changed since the 1960s and 70s? Of course it would. And a great deal has changed. America is much more ethnically diverse, much less religious. Boys have far fewer male models in their lives. Fewer men marry, and normal boy behavior is largely held in contempt by their feminist teachers, principals, and therapists. Do any or all of these factors more than the availability of guns? Let's briefly investigate each factor. Regarding ethnic diversity, the countries that not only have the fewest mass murders, but the lowest homicide rates are also the least ethnically diverse, such as Japan and nearly all European countries. So too, the American states that have homicide rates as low as Western Europe countries are the least ethnically and racially diverse. Now, I know I'm committing heresy right here, because whenever you talk about race, what you're supposed to say is this, and you're supposed to be really serious when you say it. Our strength is our diversity. So before you go to sleep at night, you're supposed to fold your hands and say, our strength is our diversity. So no matter what the question, no matter what the problem, that's always the answer. But this article seems to be saying, no, that's not true. The article goes on to say that the American states that have homicide rates as low as Western European countries are the least ethnically and racially diverse. The four lowest are New Hampshire, North Dakota, Maine, and Idaho. Now, America, being the most ethnically and racially diverse country in the world, could still have low homicide rates if A, Americans were Americanized, but the left has hyphenated, balkanized, if you will, Americans, and B, most black males grew up with fathers. So if we weren't talking about African Americans and Hispanic Americans, etc., and if most black kids lived in homes where there were a father and a mother, according to Dennis Prager, the murder rates would go way down. Regarding boys' need for fathers, in 2008, then Senator Barack Obama, again, this is coming from Barack Obama, told an audience, children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. Now, needless to say, Barack Obama is an African American. So this is not some coast howley or some cracker being critical of black folks. This is Barack Obama himself. And I'm going to stop here and ask, well, are there a lot of black families that don't have fathers? And the answer is yes. And what's the reason? The reason is that when LBJ kicked off his Great Society, he provided a lot of benefits for children. Good politics. Everybody likes children. So children living in a home with a mother would be entitled to a lot of bennies. But as soon as a man moved into that house, the bennies stopped. So you wind up with a lot of single parents, a lot of women raising children, and the law discourages the fathers from living with those children. And we're living with it right now. So again, to repeat Barack's statistics, children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. The Great Society. Yet the Times has published columns and studies showing how relatively unimportant fathers are, and more educated women believe this is dangerous nonsense. Children don't need fathers. This is the era of the empowerment of women. Men are just a distraction. Patriarchy. Oppression. We don't need no stinking men in our households. Then there is marriage. Nearly all men who murder are single, and their number is increasing. Finally, since the 1960s, we've been living in a culture of grievance. Whereas in the past, people generally understood that life is hard and or they have to work on themselves to improve their lives. For half a century, the left has drummed into Americans' minds the belief that their difficulties are caused by American society. And with respect to the fatherless families, they're probably correct. In particular, it's sexism, racism, and patriarchy. And the more aggrieved people are, the more dulled their consciences. So I think the idea of having a conscience is now kind of on the scrap heap of history. Conscience, what's that? Well, that's that little voice inside your head that tells you what's right and what's wrong. You don't have to have, somebody else telling you. You ought to know that yourself. And if you do something wrong, your conscience ought to bother you. Now, I know this is really an old-fashioned idea, so I'll move on. When you don't ask intelligent questions, you cannot come up with intelligent answers. So then, with regard to murder in America, until Americans stop allowing the left to ask the questions, we will have no intelligent answers. I ought to read this. I ought to read this probably every month because it's dynamite. It really lays it out. Okay, so much for Demi, as you were for the Second Amendment. Now let's go on to semi-economy. This is that portion of the program where I try to figure out why the Daily News doesn't run editorials. And today is no exception. Here's the Daily News editorial for today. As I point out, the Daily News runs editorials from USA Today. They're always the same. They always bash Trump. They never have a Guam dimension whatsoever. Here we are today. Time to hold a full House vote. Let's be clear. If the House of Representatives wants to launch an impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump's conduct, it need not hold a vote. So here we go again, If they couldn't bash Donald Trump, even Gannett wouldn't have anything on their editorial page. Okay, so once again, I'm going to grade the Gannett paper right now. I gave them a 0. They don't deserve a 0. But I think it's the lowest grade I can give them. There has not been a real editorial in that paper since I came back from my trip. It's all Gannett all the time. On the other hand, the Post has done a pretty credible job here of writing editorials. Today is no exception. It's our right to tell elected officials their statements reflect or don't reflect on how we feel. In the latest of a number of off-island trips, Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio spent 2 weeks in Washington, D.C. and New York City until he came back to his office this week. In those two weeks, he was given 10 minutes to address the fourth meeting of the Special Political and Decolonization Committee in the United Nations, also known as the Fourth Committee. And I've talked about that before. Told you that the Fourth Committee has members like China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, etc. A number of government officials and other, quote, delegates who assume they represent the collective stance of the entire 160,000 plus residents of Guam have spent government funds for their airfare, hotel, and per diem, usually spending more days than necessary in New York City to make a speech of roughly 10 minutes to a UN committee or some activity affiliated with the UN. Since we taxpayers pay for the tab when these trips are made, it's helpful to know exactly what these officials and other, quote, delegates see on behalf of the rest of the Guam community. Let's take Tenorio's speech as an example. On October 10, The lieutenant governor was given 10 minutes to address the UN committee. Guam's status as a territory of the United States, Tenorio said, is unacceptable. I guess he's ruled. Guam's status as an unincorporated territory is unacceptable. Just like Trump should be impeached, and Trump's stance on transgenders in the military is dead wrong. And of course, Josh has a platform from which to speak. Josh is the first and probably only, at least that we know of, homosexual lieutenant governor in the United States. And he's done a pretty good job of that. He's gone to the gay pride parade. He's taken objection to Donald Trump's policies, etc. And now at the UN, he's telling the folks there it's unacceptable. The status of Guam as a territory is unacceptable. And it has been the policy of our government to seek change. Our government, meaning the government of Guam. Now, he said our government. Now, I wonder if that's the same government, the same our as the our in our people. Territories like Guam are, quote, owned by but not a part of the United States, Tenorio continued. He then portrayed Guamanians as a victim. Yeah, a victim of the federal court system, which on Guam is presided by no other than one of the most highly respected Guam women, Frances Tydinko Gatewood. But the Guamanians are a victim of Frances Gatewood and the federal court system. The judicial system of our administering power has not played the leading role for civil rights and human rights on this issue, despite providing justice for other groups. Now, you know, when a guy says stuff like this, and he's a government official, he ought to have his mouth washed out with soap. Just standing back and looking at the judicial system of the United States, the judicial system of the United States is the envy of the whole world. We have an independent judiciary. Okay, so it's time for that first break already. I'm going to come back and beat up on Josh a little bit more after the break. Hang on.
Take Care Wellness presents the 7th Save the Susu Dance Fitness Fundraiser, October 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Teason High School. Tickets are $10 in advance, $15 the day of the event, and $5 for kids ages 6 to 12. Tickets are available at Take Care Wellness, Guam Cancer Care, and through Marissa Collins. Grand prize for the raffle is a round-trip ticket to Asia or Micronesia from United Airlines. All proceeds benefit Guam Cancer Care. This message is made possible by the stations of Choice Broadcasting. It's a one-of-a-kind wine fundraiser. Wahan Sustainable Culture presents Wine in the Garden. The Hamamoto Gardens help support food sovereignty, security, and sustainability while sipping wines from around the world, surrounded by 50-some acres of beautiful farm and garden. Tickets are $75 each. Proceeds support education and outreach on how important, easy, and fun sustainable practices can be. Wine in the Garden is on Saturday evening, October 26th, starting at 5. For more details, go to our website, gusustainable.org, or call 687-6491.
Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie is brought to you by American Water Tech, a passion for improving lives through better water.
Welcome back to Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie, Guam's single voice of reason. Call now, 888-TALK. That's 888-8255.
Yeah, by all means, give me a buzz and we'll talk about these issues. And, of course, if you're watching the live streaming on Facebook, make sure that you go up there and click on that share button. Do your friends a big favor and share Tall Tales with your friends. They'll be eternally grateful, well, at least until the end of the program. Okay, so going on here with Josh. He portrayed Guamanians as a victim of the federal court system, which on Guam is presided by Frances Gatewood. The judicial system of our administering power has not played the leading role for civil rights and human rights on this issue, despite providing justice for other groups. Well, I don't know that the federal judiciary is in the human rights business. That's a word that the left has kind of co-opted. As far as civil rights is concerned, you'll recall that Dave Davis suit was a civil rights suit based on the 15th Amendment of the United States. The Bill of Rights is the source of our civil rights, and Davis filed to enforce one of his civil rights, the right to vote. But that didn't sit very well with the nationalists. Tenorio later continued, and most recently the administering powers court system has used their judicial system to interfere with our process and impede our progress towards decolonization by preventing the public expenditure of funds to advance a plebiscite pursuant to Guam law. Now, this is just wrong, and this is an untruth. Most recently, the administering powers court system has used their judicial system to interfere with our process. The court system didn't do anything at all. The court system is like a toad. The court system is not self-actuating. It doesn't do anything until someone, a party, comes along and invokes it into action. So if you read this, you'd think, yeah, the court system in the United States has used the judicial system to interfere with these folks and their rights. You'll recall that the Davis case was a case brought by a private citizen, Dave Davis. It was Dave Davis, not the court system. That's why this is just a lie. The administering powers court system has used their federal judicial system to interfere with our process. Just dead wrong. Tenorio was referring to the federal court's decision, first in the district court and later in the Ninth Circuit, that struck down Guam's law for a plebiscite on political status because it discriminates against those who are not native inhabitants of Guam. Governor Leon Guerrero and her lieutenant governor have shied from saying publicly, when previously asked, if GovGuam would appeal the federal court's ruling in a final pitch to the United States Supreme Court. And by the way, there's more sophistry that goes on here too, and that's this, that Josh would have you believe that there is this discrete group of people called Chamorros, a ethno-racial group, and that the federal court system is a self-actuating operation to deny rights to this ethno-racial group. Now, at the same time, the proponents of this plebiscite have come forward and say, oh, no, this is not about race. This is about native inhabitants, not about race at all. Well, you can't have it both ways, Josh. If you want to play the ethno-racial group, then you need to be right up front. And you need to say, this is about Chamorros. It's not about native inhabitants. It's not about the census in 1950, et cetera. It's about Chamorros. You might even have a chance if you presented it to the Supreme Court that way. But the attempt to finesse it with this native inhabitant thing obviously didn't work well at all for you. Okay, so if it's GovGuam's strategy to appeal to a UN committee to somehow influence the outcome in the federal courts, such a move could be futile. You know, that's not how you prevail in the courts of the United States, by going to a committee of the United Nations, especially the Fourth Committee, and shooting your mouth off. Now, you know, it's a great opportunity to virtue signal and to do to play the identity politics game and the dog whistle game with all your Chamorro nationalist adherents, but it ain't going to do nothing as far as the courts are concerned. If Guam's strategy to appeal to a UN committee to somehow influence the outcome in federal courts, such a move could be futile unless the trip itself was the agenda rather than the delivery of a roughly 10-minute message and the expectation of a realistic outcome. Well, I think the Post hit the nail right on the head. The trip. The object of the trip was the trip, not any particular accomplishment arising from the trip. Ironically, it's this very same administering powers court system that Guam residents count on when it comes to putting corrupt government officials and major drug dealers on trial. This, quote, administering powers court system is the very one that Guam residents run to when we feel deprived of our rights and protections under the U.S. Constitution. And as I said earlier, it's the envy of the entire world. We have an independent judiciary. When we feel we are deprived of our right to free speech, to carry guns to protect ourselves, to protection from unreasonable law enforcement searches, and when we seek protections against an array of discrimination based on the color of our skin, hello, Josh, and our gender, among other things, once again, Josh, hello, the magic word, among many others, the administering powers court system is the venue in which we seek redress. Without explicitly telling his international audience that the federal court decisions have struck down Guam's natives-only votes as racially biased, the lieutenant governor went on to tell the world that, quote, historical injustices imposed upon Guam's native inhabitants, including indigenous Chamorro people, have not been acknowledged or resolved. Discrimination against the indigenous people of Guam is contrary to the aspirations of the General Assembly and its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now, I never quite know how to deal with this indigenous people argument. This is a new one. Robert Underwood takes credit for introducing the idea of indigeneity into the dialogue about 30 years ago. So I guess I'm still, my understanding word is still frozen in National Geographic magazine. And I really liked National Geographic when I was a kid. I had that wanderlust, the curiosity about what goes on in other parts of the world. And you'd find articles in National Geographic about these tribes somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia or Africa or whatever that had never had contact with Western civilization. And one of the points made was that these indigenous civilizations are often very poorly equipped to deal with Western civilization when it lands on their shores. A pretty good example would be Australia. When the Brits decided they needed a new penal colony and shipped all their prisoners to Botany Bay in Australia, at the time there were 300,000 Aboriginal people living in Australia. These are people of color. And without going into a lot of detail, they had made a life for themselves in places in Australia that are extremely inhospitable to life. And that continent was supporting 300,000 people. So the Aboriginals developed all kinds of techniques for surviving in that particular geographic location. Well, when Western civilization landed with guns and knives and diseases, and guns and steel, guns, germs, and steel, etc., the indigenous folks were not well equipped to deal with it at all. They didn't do very well in the Western civilization that was transplanted to Australia. That's kind of where I was with the whole idea of indigeneity. If we look at Guam, however, Guam was the first Pacific island to be colonized of all the islands in the Pacific. The first one, 1565, the Spaniards landed here. So Guam has, in effect, been an extension of Western civilization for how many years is that? Over 400 years. And I think if you look around a little bit, you'd see that the folks on Guam who claim ancestry going back to the indigenous pre-Hispanic folks, they've adapted pretty well to European civilization. I can cite you some examples that people that have adapted more better than people with pure European ancestry. So the whole idea of, well, these are indigenous people, and therefore, I'm sorry, I have a hard time getting on the right side of it. Maybe, I suppose Jesse will call me up and set me straight on that what I'm saying is at least blasphemy, if not something more serious. Okay, well, I've been doing a lot of talking here, and I'm finally going to get some relief because I've got our Carl on the line. Good afternoon, our Carl.
Hi, good afternoon, Bob. Yeah, I'd like to chime in regarding if we could imagine a scenario that, to people that want to separate from America, it would be the perfect scenario. And that would be if not a single Spaniard ever landed on Guam, ever. Not a single Japanese or American ever landed on Guam. Not a single one. We would have the indigenous language still intact. The indigenous people would be here. The irony is that not a single person listening with any Chamorro blood would be alive because we all have intermixed blood. So not a single Spaniard, not a single American, not a single Japanese, no Germans, no Chinese, the various people that came through here, no Mexicans, no Filipinos, not a single Filipino. It's just pristine. And this is the perfect paradise that, that they're envisioning. If only these oppressors hadn't come here and done these things to us. And of course there were some bad things that were done, but we survived. We're a rugged, strong people. We took some of the things from the Spanish culture, the American culture, the Japanese culture, the German culture, various things, and we brought them into our culture to make it part of us. Spanish rice and latija and all these recipes and ways of cooking and words. And that's how a strong and vigorous and thriving and growing culture grows and expands. It absorbs from outside. It doesn't close itself off. So I just brought this up because I just wanted to propose that kind of a mental exercise of imagining what if this ideal scenario had happened, and we never had anyone, not a single outsider, ever step foot on Guam. It's totally and absolutely pristine. The jungles were still here, and it was all the indigenous language, not a single Spanish word or American word or Japanese word or any other word. It's just all indigenous.
Yeah, well,
it's interesting to play that mental game and think about that. And some people say, that in response to, that Guam would go on and Guam would live even if the Americans left. I don't think that's an important question. I think the most important question is what would that Guam look like, and how many of the people living here would still want to live here without that economic security, military security, and all the various things that come with the American presence. Would anyone, even Chamorros living here, want to live in a Guam with no outside influence at all?
Well, Carl, there is a group, the group that favors Chamocracy, the government of, by, and for Chamorros, that are favoring the Guam exit, separation from the United States, and I think Josh Tenorio is the prime example with his misstatements before the United Nations. I think he's a prime example, so...
I just think we need to, as far as, my view and many other Chamorros I've spoken to, we appreciate the outside influences. Sometimes there have been some things that have been challenged to us, but we're strong and vigorous and hardy people. We've taken what we want to expand and grow our culture, and we've improved our culture, and we're actually thankful for a lot of those outside influences. you know, the foods and the words and the concepts and the ideas and the science and all those things that have enriched our lives, you know. So
Well, if you stop to look at it, Carl, if you stop to look at it, the history of the world is movement. Civilization started in the Fertile Crescent, and it spread west. It spread into Europe. It was based primarily on the ability to herd animals and some breeds of grass that turned into grain. And the migration continued out of Europe, across the ocean, all over the world. So to say that because people have migrated and have not stayed in one place throughout history and are therefore no longer indigenous to that place and are therefore somehow disabled in dealing with the indigenous people of the world, just doesn't stand up under any kind of an analysis at all.
Yeah, and even among the indigenous people, the North American Indians, you know, the three great tribal federations, there was a lot of battles and conquests, and some of them really brutal. I mean, they scalped each other. You know, there was really a tremendous fight for territory, and they would, you know, the winning tribe would kill off who was not useful to the victorious tribe, and many times they would take those who they thought would be useful to the victorious tribe, and they would enslave them. They would take them along. So, you know, the whole history of mankind over 4,000 years is a history of conquests and battles and man's inhumanity to man. You know, it's just, that's the way it was. And it's only in the Western culture among the British and then in the colonies where, and I think in the British, it was because of the translation of the Bible, where people began to think about people being equal to each other and having a value before the eyes of God.
I hear the music in the background, Carl, so I'm going to have to let you go. The Real Joe Clues is playing back home again in Indiana, allowing me to say, you know, I've been to some really exotic places. I've been to Indonesia, I've been to India, and I've been to Indiana. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, Bob, I'll be listening.
We understand what matters to you because at Docomo Pacific, we're a family too. With the Now Family program, Mom, Dad, and kids stay connected on the latest devices the whole family can enjoy. For just $155 a month, get 3 lines with 30 gigs of 4G LTE data each, and endless use of your favorite apps without affecting your monthly data bucket. Add more, get more, save more. Docomo Pacific, better together. Some conditions apply.
Here at APL, our core values give the company its heart and soul. Whether it's connecting your business with our global network through our newly enhanced service or investing our efforts into giving back to the community, APL is committed to serving you. We humbly honor the opportunity to find innovative solutions for you and your business. To learn more about our enhanced service, call 588-4651 or visit www.apl.com/Guam for more details.
Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie is brought to you by Bank Pacific, banking on the Pacific for 65 years.
So I got about, 6 minutes until that big halftime show that we have every day at 1700, 5 o'clock. The marching bands, the cheerleaders, the sword swallowers, fire eaters, the cannon fire at the end of the show. So rather than go back into what I was doing, which I'll pick up after the halftime show, I've been peeking at some of the comments that came in, and some of them are pretty relevant to the discussion that we've been having here. And let me see if I can find some of them and elaborate on them, or at least highlight them for you. James Howard says, it's a good thing we can count on the U.S. as you were on the UN, the United Nations, to help island nations. They have done so much, like the time when... Do you have a cricket sound effect there, Real Joe Cruz? Yeah, like the time when, and nothing. And Rico Blancaflor, Lieutenant Governor's rhetoric has a squad-like feel. Well, maybe, you know, this whole transgender thing catches on the way Josh wants it to. Maybe he could be he could be the fifth gal in the squad. I don't know what the correct term. Once we get past I don't know how to handle this stuff. And then if Lieutenant Governor Tenorio was not Lieutenant Governor because he was off island, you know, getting back into this controversy between Senator Moylan and Tina Rose Munya Barnes, asking the question, well, if Tina Rose Munya Barnes is the acting Lieutenant Governor, can she be the Speaker at the same time? Doesn't seem like she could. And, of course, I have the complete answer to that question, and that's this. We don't need no stinking lieutenant governor. We should ask Congress to abolish the position. It's useless. Well, in Josh's case, it's worse than useless. Real Joe Cruiser was a TV program starring Richard Boone way back called Have Gun Will Travel. I don't know if you ever saw the...
I have not seen it.
Yeah, Have Gun Will Travel. And this guy named Paladin lived in San Francisco, and if you had a problem and you needed a gunslinger, wire Paladin, San Francisco. Have Gun Will Travel, and he'd go wherever, and he'd solve your problem with a gun. Yeah. Now, I think Josh must have been watching that when he was young, because he perhaps will start his own TV program called Have Mouth Will Travel, and he'll go to Washington and the United Nations, and he won't solve problems. He will shoot down his very own island by going to Washington and dissing the Republican members of the Senate who were depending upon for that war claims fix. He'll diss them again along with the president by saying he favors impeachment. Then he'll go to the United Nations Fourth Committee, as disreputable group as you'll find, and lay all kinds of bad raps on the United States. Have Mouth Will Travel. Let me, Josh, wire Josh, Guam. I'll shoot down our island. Okay, so let's see. What else have I got here? He didn't, but won't self-determined help hold back the seas? My self-determination. There we go here. Won't self-determination help hold back the seas? My self-determination is an employed straight male. James Howard, oh yeah. Let's see. Hawaii bureaucrats stole Hawaii from the indigenous islanders. Excuses of Bola Bola sings out. Well, if you go back and look at the history of Hawaii, there were a group of white folks in Hawaii that were the planters, ran the plantations, etc. And in 1893, they did engineer a coup to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. I'll come back to that after this big halftime show that we have at 5 o'clock.
The Point is KUSG, Hagåtña, Guam, 93.3 FM and 104.3 HD3.
Signs of an escalation. I'm Jack Callahan, Fox News. In the ongoing invasion of northern Syria, a potential deadly clash is brewing.
The military operation against what Turkey calls terrorists has now evolved into something perhaps much bigger, much more dangerous. A war between Turkey, a NATO member, and Syria, a country backed by Russia. Kurdish officials wasted little time in finding a new partner after the withdrawal of U.S. forces, which they described as a stab in the back. Syrian government troops under Bashar al-Assad reached the front lines within hours of the deal, a welcome sight to many Kurds on the ground.
Fox's Steve Harrigan in Syria. The Trump administration hitting Turkey with economic sanctions on Monday, including the halting of talks on a possible $100 billion trade deal. President Trump also called Turkey's President Erdogan to stand down.
President Trump communicated to him very clearly that the United States of America wants Turkey to stop the invasion, to implement an immediate ceasefire, and to begin to negotiate with Kurdish forces in Syria to bring an end to the violence.
Vice President Mike Pence will soon head to the Middle East in the hopes of brokering a ceasefire. A Fort Worth, Texas police officer has been charged with murder. Prosecutors say Officer Aaron Dean was reckless when he shot a woman to death through the window of her own home on Saturday after being dispatched there to check on her welfare.
We value the trust that we've had with our community. We will continue to build that trust, and we will continue to be as transparent as possible in all police matters.
Fort Worth Police Sergeant Chris Daniels, 28-year-old Tatiana Jefferson died at the scene. Officer Dean now free on bond. The Bay Area shaken by an earthquake Monday evening, epicentered near Walnut Creek, just east of Oakland. It was a long rolling motion, but no reports of damage or injuries. America is listening to Fox News.
It's a one-of-a-kind wine fundraiser. Guahan Sustainable Culture presents Wine in the Garden. The Hamamoto Gardens help support food sovereignty, security, and sustainability while sipping wines from around the world, surrounded by 50-some acres of beautiful farm and garden. Tickets are $75 each. Proceeds support education and outreach on how important, easy, and fun sustainable practices can be. Wine in the Garden is on Saturday evening, October 26, starting at 5. For more details, go to our website, gusustainable.org, or call 687-6491.
When you think about better water, think Kinetico softened water. Kinetico water conditioners work like no other, supplying a continuous flow of luxuriously soft water without disruption and without use of electricity. After all, better water flows from better thinking. Kinetico.
American Water Tech, a passion for improving lives through better water. Call American Water Tech at 649-2301 or email info@americanwatertech.com.
A dozen Democrats will take the stage in Ohio tonight for their latest debate.
Tonight's CNN New York Times debate at Otterbein University will set an attendance record. For the first time, 12 candidates are on the same stage in a single 3-hour debate.
When we do debates, the goal is to get people out of their silos. The goal is to make news, to find out something new here.
Fox News politics editor Chris Steyerwalt says that can present a bigger challenge with a bigger field of candidates sharing the same stage at the same time. The top tier of candidates has not shifted much, though Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has picked up ground. In some surveys, she now leads former Vice President Joe Biden. Jared Halpern, Fox News.
That devastating fire north of L.A. late last week may have started from sparking power lines. The Saddle Ridge fire burned 13 square miles, destroyed 17 homes. Southern California Edison reports a problem occurred on some of its transmission lines near the spot where the fire started. Witnesses report seeing sparks there. Authorities in northeastern Spain say 37 protesters have been injured during ongoing clashes with police at Barcelona's airports. Tempers flaring in Spain's Catalonia region after the country's Supreme Court found 12 separatist leaders guilty of illegally promoting Catalan independence. China's President Xi Jinping issuing a threat as the unrest continues in Hong Kong.
Chinese President Xi Jinping saying any attempt to split China will end in crushed bodies and shattered bones. That according to state TV. Xi stopping short of referencing any particular point of tension, but his comments come as his administration is challenged by months of protests in Hong Kong, many of them turning violent. China has accused the United States of stirring up the unrest. Simon Owen, Fox News.
Asian stocks closing Tuesday mixed. Dow futures are up more than 130 points. I'm Jack Callahan. This is Fox News.
Did you know that home loan rates have plunged again? Would you like to take advantage of these lower rates to help lower your monthly payments? Refinancing doesn't have to be for another 30 years. It can be for 10, 15, or 20 years. It's up to you. Reduce your monthly payments. Pay off your loan earlier. At Bank Pacific, where we're open to closing your loan in a hurry.
Bank Pacific, where others put branches, we place roots.
Equal housing lender. Credit conditions apply.
If you've ever struggled for breath, you know what a scary experience it is. Whether you have asthma, emphysema, COPD, lung cancer, or another respiratory illness, the right medical treatment makes all the difference. GRMC's Pulmonology Clinic has the latest technology and respiratory equipment, staffed by world-class pulmonologists. Make an appointment today with GRMC's Pulmonology Clinic and start breathing easier. GRMC, where patients are partners.
Talk Tales with Bob Klitzkie is brought to you by Bank Pacific, banking on the Pacific for 65 years.
Another dynamite halftime show. So we now launch into the second half of Tall Tales for the 15th of October, 2019. And I was explaining before the halftime show that in 1893, a group of haole planters on Hawaii engineered a coup and deposed Queen Liliuokalani as the queen of the Kingdom of Hawaii, the Queendom of Hawaii, and attempted and established something called the Republic of Hawaii, which the United States didn't recognize. And then in, was it 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii, and as you know, Hawaii became a state in 1959. From the time of the annexation on, Hawaii was an incorporated territory of the United States. So some people would go back to that historical grievance, kind of like the reading that I used on the Second Amendment here, and say, well, you know, we've got to go back and right that historical wrong that happened over 100 years ago. And along the same lines, you can depend on Jesse to engage in what I call presentism. You take facts or you take occurrences that from a long time ago that occurred in a particular moral environment or climate, and then attempt to apply today's morals or values to what happened, say, 100 years ago, and say, well, it was wrong because we don't do things that way anymore. So here's what Jesse Limtiaco says. He says, Guam was conquered / stolen by the Spanish and then transferred ownership of the conquered / stolen land to the USA, giving the people of Guam U.S. citizenship, SNAP benefits, Section 8 monies, and other U.S. government subsidies by way of taxpayers in the United States makes many people forget about that. Yeah, I suppose it does. The fact that the Spanish-American War was 122 years ago probably has something to do with people forgetting. And I'm going to get back into the lie that is told about the insular cases here if I ever finish up with Jimmy Cotney. But Josh has really set the table here with a full load of something. there's a story in the Post where the Post covered it pretty well. And, oh yeah, and there's one other comment here that I want to pick up off Facebook, and that is, yeah, Jose Martinez. Lee's Resolution 16, as you were Lee, Resolution 16, that's Jim Moylan's resolution requiring drug tests in the legislative branch. Lee, Resolution 16 violates Fourth Amendment rights. This is interesting. Hiding behind the U.S. Constitution after returning from a trip to the UN, disparaging the colonizing laws of the United States. And she's got a link there to the story in the paper. And then let's see, I've got a question here from somebody. How will the average resident, quote, not wealthy or politically connected, of Guam benefit from decolonization and independence? My answer is it won't. It won't at all. Okay, so let me jump back into this article here in the Post. Guam delegation makes decolonization plea to the United Nations. And here's another, here's a quote from Andrew Gumatautau. Our journey to be present here with this committee convened is not a chance to bemoan before the world monotonous recitations of victimhood. He said, that's not the reason. You could have fooled me, but rather a serious occasion to join in and witness the sheer tenacity of ourselves alongside fellow colonized people, relentlessly asserting our existence. That's very poetic, Andrew. Maybe that's the Andrews. You know, our poet laureate is Andrew. This Andrew Gumatautau seems to have a way with words. The system of the colonizer, and now the colonizer is the United States. It's another one of these things where your old grasp of vocabulary isn't helpful anymore. The system of the colonizer is, and the colonizer, by the way, is a pejorative. It's not a nice thing to say. You wouldn't say, oh, Mrs. Jones, your boy is so smart. I hope he grows up to be a colonizer. That would be a curse. The system of the colonizer is designed to eradicate indigenous culture and rights, like the indigenous culture that was pictured on the front page of yesterday's Daily News, I guess. You remember those kids all dressed up in the thatched outfit?
Grass skirts.
Yeah, I guess that's the indigenous culture that the colonizer is attempting to eradicate. This comes from Samantha Barnett. Now, I don't know who Samantha Barnett is, but Barnett's
That's Chris Malefunction's daughter.
Oh, really? Well,
Yeah.
Barnett's kind of sounds like a colonizer's name.
Yeah.
As long as we're going to toss labels around. Barnett, oh, is she a colonizer? Yeah. We know defeat is too often the verdict for the colonized when their case is tried in the colonizer's court. Despite this, the sovereignty movement continues to grow. Now, you know, we go from the Commission on Decolonization, which is really the Commission for Chamorro Independence, and then we talk about self-determination of Chamorro people, but there's nothing in any of this that's anything but pro-independence, pro-separation. There's nothing about statehood. It's all pro-separation. And despite this, the sovereignty movement continues to grow. In response to this court decision, thousands of Chamorros and allies marched through the streets of Guahan to demonstrate the demand for colonization. And they demonstrated that demand where? at the United States District Court in Agana. The continued militarization of Guam, along with growing numbers of immigrants seeking the American dream, has resulted in the undeniable displacement of the indigenous people of Guam. Let's go back to Carl Nelson's formulation. The indigenous people of Guam first felt the impact of European civilization in 1565. This isn't something that's kind of new. The continued militarization of Guam, along with the growing numbers of immigrants seeking the American dream, has resulted in the undeniable displacement of the indigenous people of Guam, Melvin Borja said. And then he goes on to say, we suffer toxins in our soil and water that lead to cancers and debilitating diseases from which we lose family members when family is everything and elders are the holder of wisdom through the millennia. How much wisdom dies with them. Now, you know who said that? Senator Kelly Marsh, parenthesis, Titano.
Wow.
Yeah. We lose family members when family is everything and elders are the holders of wisdom through the millennium. Kelly Marsh, parenthesis, Titano, close parenthesis. Another common theme throughout testimony before the committee, climate change. Many non-self-governing territories like many non-self-governing territories, our lack of sovereignty. Well, that's a non-self-governing territory with a lack of sovereignty. Oh, is that right? Is a major obstacle to effectively, quickly, and holistically turning the tide on this global crisis. That's what Senator Regine Biscoe-Lee said. So if the non-self-governing territories of the world had sovereignty, then they could quickly and holistically turn the tide on this crisis of climate change. That's what Senator Regine Biscoe-Lee said. I wonder how much it cost us to send these comedians to New York to testify before the Fourth Committee. Each petitioner from Guam also pushed for the UN to take the next step in supporting Guam's decolonization. It's imperative that you approve a visiting mission to Guam and act with great and meaningful urgency to finally help break the chains of colonialism. This is Ricky Orsini. She's Marsh Titano's chief of staff. It's quite an entourage we sent to the Fourth Committee. The Guam delegation also asked for the UN to hold its annual committee of 24 regional seminar on the island. There isn't an expected timeline for a UN response, although sites for regional seminars are determined in the spring. Well, all very interesting. None of it is unexpected. Most of it fits the pattern. And as far as Josh is concerned, it comes back again to what I was saying about people who hold elected office ought to be a little bit careful about scratching their own itch. Josh's issue are the whole LBGTQ. And by the way, I understand the word Q has been rehabilitated. The Q stands for queer, and it's okay to use it again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's now become acceptable again. So Josh's itches are the whole LGBTQ transgender thing, and obviously ragging against the United States and beating the so-called decolonization drum in international fora, as well as going to Congress, dissing the Republicans and asking for the impeachment of Trump. I keep coming back to what I don't think I'm the only person who would like to see this. What I would like to see is this: an effective, efficient government that provides basic services in accordance with the rule of law on at least a break-even basis. So, Josh, if you want to go shoot your mouth after the United Nations or Senator Regine Biscoli, if you did it on your own nickel, I'd say fine, but not on my nickel. I got a couple calls coming in here. Let's see. I've got a Pete. Yeah, and you know, if I don't understand what Pete tells me, you know what I'm going to say, Real Joe Cruz?
It's a personnel matter?
I'm going to say repeat. Yeah, the twin brothers, Pete and Repeat. Yeah. And then I've got a Joe. Now, this isn't you, because you're the Real Joe Cruz. So I'm going to take Pete and Joe. I'm going to take Pete first, and then from there I'm going to go to Joe. What can you tell me, Pete, that I don't know, realizing that I've only got about 40 more minutes till the end of the show?
Yeah, we're never going to unpack everything that's being discussed today in that time. But you touched on a whole plethora of different issues surrounding political status. But one thing I wanted to hone in on and ask you about is, do you, Mr. Bob, think that even if Guam were to select statehood, that would actually be a reality given what the past history of states entering into the Union has been, as well as the current or more recent attempt of Puerto Rico to enter into the Union?
I've answered that question on more than one occasion, Pete, and I've said this: statehood is not within the realm of reality, and political status is a will of the wisp. So the only thing we've got is independence, and all of this talk about self-determination and decolonization is just an excuse to allow the people who favor independence to advocate that position from the government payroll.
Well, what is wrong with that position, though? Intrinsically, or, you know, is there anything wrong with it?
There's nothing wrong with advocating independence, you know, so long as a person doesn't advocate the violent overthrow of the United States. He can advocate pretty much whatever he wants to. I just don't want to have to pay for it. Do it on your own nickel, and I won't. I probably will applaud you for coming forward and speaking your mind, but I don't want to pay for it, and that's where I am now, with Josh and Marcia Kelly and Regine Biscoli and this other game, Barnett and this group.
Yeah. Okay, so one last final question. There's been like a couple of new ideas floating around about a different elevated status other than a possession/territory. I think there was an article written a few weeks ago by someone who studies territorial relationships, and the whole thing was get it out of Department of Interior, under the Department of Interior, and have some sort of, you know, government to government or high-level government to government interaction or relationship. Do you think that's viable? It's something new. It's not something that exists currently. And again, I've advocated that very approach innumerable times on Tall Tales. My position is that Guam is part of the American empire, and it's a good place to be in the 21st century world. What we ought to do is concentrate on improving our position in the American empire, and this government-to-government thing is something that the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas has. It's called the 903 conferences, and both the United States and the Northern Marianas government have delegates to these 903 conferences, and either side can call a conference where they discuss issues of mutual importance. Now the guy over there in the easy chair, the smart money guy, is going to say, well, but Congress is going to do what it wants to do. And the answer to that, of course, it is. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. History has shown that, on theory, that's a great idea. But when push came to shove, Congress, asserted its superiority. Well, I got news for you. In our American system of government, if it's something within Congress's purview, Congress always gets its way. That's the way it is in a republic.
It's no different for a state, a territory, or the District of Columbia. So if that is your hang-up, then you need to sign up with the independentistas, because it'll never be any different, no matter how we're able to improve our situation with the United States government. The Congress is always going to be the Congress, and they're not going to, even if Congress wanted to, if they said, from now on, we're going to be inferior to the legislature on Guam on territorial matters, they couldn't do it.
Not even with an amendment?
A constitutional amendment, yeah, those are pretty hard to come by.
Right, especially since we don't have any kind of leverage.
Well, the kind of leverage we have is our power to persuade. And if you watch the performance of our government officials as they go off island and the silly things they say, our power to persuade probably couldn't get us out of a paper bag.
All right. That was my point, or the only thing I wanted to talk about. There's a whole bunch of other things to talk about, but we're limited on time, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for calling, Joe. And let's see, I've got, I'm sorry, that's Pete. Let me repeat that. Thanks a lot for calling, Pete. Okay, and then I've got Joe, but it's not the real Joe Cruz. This is another Joe. Good afternoon, another Joe.
I'll tell you what, Uncle Bob, you do not disappoint. You and your show, this 903, I'll look into that more. I missed the first part. Is that part of the U.S. system, or is that part of an international system, the 903 conference?
No, it's part of the covenant between the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas and the United States. It has a treaty dimension. But
it's a treaty. It's a part of a treaty. It would be it's called something different if we were to establish something with the federal if we were ever in a position to establish something with the U.S. federal government. So having said that, I'm not sure if you want to add something to that.
No, it's just part of the same theme that I keep hammering on. What we need to do is quit moaning and groaning and set our efforts to improving our relationship with the national government inside this system that we're in.
Yeah, sure. Well, we've tried everything else. Why not try that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
What is the theme? When all else fails, read the instructions.
Yeah. Well, we're more willing to drop back and punt as soon as things get a little bit difficult.
Yeah, and the instructions are pretty there. They're there somewhere, like the Constitution, or there's other things to turn to.
Well, the instructions ordinarily come from Tall Tales every afternoon at 4.
There you go. That's another place for instructions. So, about the thing is, the cute part of the acronym. I was watching a comedy of a very intelligent African American who's I think of my age group, middle age, excuse me, or approaching middle age, and she was saying she was trying to cater to her, I don't know, it's her brother, I think, who's a huge age gap between her and her brother, where he's considered a millennial, and she was complaining at how he's constantly correcting her and how to be politically correct, and she's to the point where this guy, he's a millennial, my brother, he's living with me and he's constantly correcting me. And I guess due to her traditions or what have you, right? She's not to the point where she's kicking him out.
I think you mean their traditions, don't you? Not her traditions.
So the funny part is her complaints that he's constantly correcting, and then the part of the complaints were, did you know that you can say queer now? When I was a kid, you said queer, that was bad. If someone turned and called someone that, those are fighting words. But now it's okay to use that. So it's really interesting how the culture has changed for some millennials, and also something we should keep in mind, that they are the dominant majority group now. If they ever got their act together, we'd be in a lot of trouble if we didn't cater to them more. You know,
Are you talking about the millennials or the queers?
the millennials. You know, your kids and grandkids. That generation, man, they're the majority. They're even bigger than the baby boomers.
Yeah.
And so we have to eventually, we're going to have to cater to their interests because, you know, especially as more of the baby boomers are becoming retired and not active intellectually, it's pretty it's scary too because before you get to the millennials, you got the Gen Xers and whoever else is around, and the tail end of the baby boomers, and we're all going to have to cater to these millennials eventually. So I don't know how that's going to turn out.
Well, I'm still a believer in geezer power, and I'm going to keep advancing the theory of geezer power
Without age and treachery?
As long as I can.
Old age and treachery beats smart aleck.
Yeah, with respect to some of these younger folks, I'm not going to use their youth and inexperience against them, like Ronald Reagan said.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Okay, here we are. We're coming up here on the 7th inning stretch. And during the 7th inning stretch, I'm going to call in someone from the bullpen, from the center field bullpen out at Wrigley Field, who's going to take over the mound tomorrow.
Hulu is all your TV in one place, plus more. Watch thousands of hit shows, movies, and award-winning Hulu originals for only $5.99 per month. It's TV without the cable contract and the freedom of on-demand streaming. Get current network shows from ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, and binge-watch every season of your favorite cable shows. Premium Hulu viewing is brought to you by Proline Automotive and AB Sports, Guam's store for Nike. To advertise on Hulu, call Choice Digital at 989-0042.
The Extra Point with Jerry Roberts of Guam Training every morning on The Ray Gibson Show.
You say your team members really want to work together and come up with great new ideas, but it's not happening. I'm Jerry Roberts, and at 7:20 a.m. on The Ray Gibson Show, we'll dig into why that might be and what to do about it.
You can find daily transcripts of The Extra Point at guamtraining.com. Tune in every weekday morning at 7:20 for The Extra Point with Jerry Roberts, brought to you by Guahan Insurance Services and First Hawaiian Bank on 93.3 The Point.
Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie is brought to you by Mescla. Try their feature special for October. 3 cups chicken, an iconic Taiwanese dish, boneless chicken sauteed with ginger, chili, star anise, scallions, basil, green beans, and a sweet soy mixture. Served with your choice of starch. Visit Mescla in Agotna and now in Tumon at the Grand Plaza Hotel. For reservations, please call 969-2652.
Well, I've been throwing pretty hard here for an aged right-hander. I still got my fastball, but I have to, during the program, I have to use my curveball and my changeup quite often just to keep the audience under control. But I've summoned in a reliever from the center field bullpen, and let's put him on camera here, real Joe Cruz. Very good. There he is, the relief pitcher who is going to take over for me starting tomorrow. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so...
No, I would still rather have you in this chair.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that, Daryl. And, of course, flattery will get you everywhere with me. Being the host of Tall Tales is a tough gig. It's not something that anyone can do. In fact, I've only found 2 people in the entire world that live up to my very high standards as to be the host of Tall Tales. So Daryl's going to take over tomorrow. Have no fear. I'll be back for Thanksgiving. I've got to go back to the mainland, and, well, I'd like to tell you what I'm going to do, but national security and all. I better not say anything. Yeah. Maybe when I come back, I could provide a redacted version of what I went to the mainland for. But I don't know. We'll have to see how it comes out.
Well, we have to share our wealth. Guam could be an example for the rest of the United States on how to move forward if it would just get its act together.
I agree.
And if we have to send our best and brightest, not the group that we sent last week, but if we need to send you over there and do what we can do,
yeah, well,
we should be contributing.
Yeah, well, you know me. If it'll help the people, I'll make the sacrifice, Daryl.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't even have to charge per diem to stay in the Waldorf when I went to testify at the United Nations. So I know you were listening in on some of the program here before I brought you in from the bullpen. So do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add on this idea of Josh Tenorio and the nationalists going to the United Nations with this, what I consider an anti-Guam rant on my tax money?
I thought that until this case, the Chamorro only vote case, Dave Davis case, until that's appealed, the courts are already setting forth their interpretation of what the government of Guam has been doing ever since the laws were passed. And this is Chamorro Land Trust and the self-determination. And that is, if you're going to use what is considered by the court to be a racial basis for what you're doing, then you can't spend money, you can't spend your revenues or exert your power as a government official if you are connected in any way, shape, or form to the United States government on this effort. I think it's a broader, we have to make a broader interpretation and come up with a strategy that's going to move the whole dialogue forward. And when you say that what you're really after is a more efficient government, that is what we elected these people to do, and that is to run the government for the people of Guam, not to look at the next status. There are people, the people of Guam can look at the next status, but the government of Guam is constrained by the ruling of the court in the Davis case,
and by
not
the
specifically,
Act.
and by the Organic Act,
Yeah.
to do what it is they were elected and paid to do. And so I don't think that they are acquitting themselves well. I think that there's more leadership that they should be exhibiting here and more statesmanship in this issue without stifling the voices of the people of Guam. And that's why I really enjoy the discussion. But the government of Guam officials are the wrong people to get involved in the discussion. They have a job to do, and this is not one of them.
Exactly. So, Daryl, we got Francis on the line here. Francis called yesterday, but he didn't have much time to stay on the line, so he's back today. Good afternoon, Francis.
Good afternoon, Bob and Daryl. I wanted clarification. You said that not the same people that we sent last week. I wanted you to clarify we, because I had nothing to do with that, and I didn't sign off on anything or anybody assigning or to being represented in the United Nations. And I wish they'd establish a listing of people that are part of are in the independence group or whatever political status, so we can identify who they are, as we all will probably coming next election. But wouldn't it be legal, Bob, if we knew who the people who were supporting independence, whatever political status, which is I'm not totally against, but would it be legal to address that and identify all who are part of the independent movement or whatever political status? Would that be illegal to publish?
Well, if a person knew, he would have the ability to publish the names of those in the independent movement. I think that the people themselves have done a pretty good job of doing that.
Yeah. So Senator Bisco Lee would have that available for the public, listening of the people that she addressed as the people are oppressed when she said the people.
Yeah. So she should be able to present us a list of the names of the people that she purports to represent, right? Is that your point, Francis?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's all. Signing out. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Good call. Very good. Thank you, Francis. So I got a couple of interesting points here. I'm looking at it out of the corner of my eye at the Facebook comments. There's a guy named Mark Ana. That's my thoughts as well. If people think the government is bad now, imagine it without any federal government around. And then Peter J. Santos, well, the chokehold the U.S. has on Guam is what causes the artificially high cost of living. Well, the chokehold.
And I thought that so much of this economy is funded by federal activity, federal grants, and the type of economy that's possible because the American flag is flying over it. We don't see as many tourists even going to the Northern Marianas as coming to Guam.
Now,
they're similarly situated.
If you wanted to talk chokehold, like the way the French run their colonies, you go to the Caribbean, there's a huge difference between the French and then the Dutch and the English colonies. There isn't that much commerce in the French colonies.
No.
Because the French have tariffs and high taxes, and they see their colonies as profit centers. We don't have any tariffs here. Guam's a free port. You know, that would be a chokehold. Guam is a free port, thanks to the insular cases. The uniformity clause of the Constitution does not apply here, getting us out from all kinds of federal constraints. I think perhaps what Peter J. Santos means when he says chokehold, you know, now that's a really nice sounding phrase. Oh, it's a chokehold. Conjures up all kinds of mental images, but I think what he may be talking about is the so-called Jones Act, the laws that require that intercoastal shipping be on American ships. But that's again part of my approach to where we are right now. We should use our efforts to ameliorate some of the bad effects of the Jones Act instead of sending people to the United Nations to kvetch about things that really don't matter that much.
And if anybody really dug down into the value of the Jones Act to Guam, you know, the shipping companies that are serving Guam from the United States have actually put brand new ships on this line, and they can afford to do so for two reasons. One, because they're getting subsidized by the U.S. government to do this, for shipbuilding, for intercoastal trade, but also because the amount of money we spend to bring U.S. goods to Guam, because we demand those goods. We don't demand the very same goods from other places where we could bring them in cheaper. We want those brands and those packagings and those inspections and whatnot for all those goods coming from the United States. And we're willing to pay the price, and we can afford to pay those prices. And those keep those ships coming back and forth just as fast as they can.
And if we didn't have the so-called Jones Act, I wonder which foreign flag carriers would want to serve Guam on a regular basis. Only 160,000 people here.
Right.
Any ship that sails in here sails out empty. They don't load up with coal or gold or Maybe the only thing they load up on when they leave is empty containers.
But we'd still have to pay the price
Of
of the
course.
ship to come here, and there wouldn't be much of a price difference when you factor all that in.
When you figure that you got to pay for the ship to Deadhead out of here, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not going to be carrying anything back to further into Asia because it'll be unloading here.
Yeah. Okay, let me see what else I've got here in some of the Facebook comments. We need respectful dialogue with the military to push funding outside the fence and work in collaboration in improving the community in all ways. I can't disagree with that. Remember the military saying we are one community. Time to live up to their word. They are the spare, we are the staff, but our leaders won't think of doing this. They need to get busy being united.
Can I toss something out for
Yeah,
a moment?
go ahead.
You know the entire H-2 program?
Yes.
Before the H-2s, we had construction workers brought in under the parole provision of the Immigration Act of 1952. So the United States could bring in anybody it needed for its own purposes. And so the workers that had to come in and work on the bases and mop floors and sling hash and besides laying brick or clearing out storm drains or whatever, those workforces were paroled into Guam to work for on the bases, and then in the 1960s, the H-2 program was ramped up, and we had lots of low-cost labor brought in here as a matter of as a need. But in fact, these were substandard wages on what would have been allowed to rise, wages allowed to rise according to supply and demand within Guam. American workers could have come out and lived on Guam. Within our own community, we could have come up and filled those jobs. But those jobs were low-paid jobs. And so what did we get out of it on the civilian side? Besides military getting base work done inexpensively. On the civilian side, it was cheaper to build houses, single-family homes. It was cheaper to build the hotels. It was cheaper to get the economy of Guam up and cranking. And only in the last several years has this H-2 flow been shut off. It's starting to be reopened gently, but just for federal purposes. And so if you want to see this in action as far as being one community, this actually militates against it. But if we wanted to get the jobs right now, the H-2 program, if it were turned right back on like they want it to be, would deprive our own people living on Guam from the opportunity to compete for these jobs and let the market work the way it will.
True enough, Daryl. I'm going to go into the card here. I've got one item on the card that I think is pretty interesting. This is an article from the Daily News, and it's Supreme Court will hear arguments related to the Insular cases, and this is another Neil Weir project.
When did that come out?
It was in today's paper.
Oh, missed it.
Arguments at the Supreme Court may affect the century-old Insular cases, legal decisions which many believe have resulted in the second-class treatment of Americans on Guam, the CNMI, and other U.S. territories. I always get a kick out of this second-class business, you know.
Mm-hmm.
A U.S. citizen on Guam is a U.S. citizen. A U.S. citizen in Nevada is a U.S. citizen. Where you live, your political rights are a function of state citizenship. Your civil rights are a function of national citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are a U.S. citizen living on Guam, you have the same rights and privileges as a U.S. citizen living anywhere else. But this guy over here in the lazy boy is saying, yeah, but we can't vote for president. And of course, we don't vote for president because we don't live in a state.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the Bill of Rights, the civil rights, etc., Same here as the rest of the country. Well, this argument goes on to say the case concerns the constitutionality of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. People on both sides of that case, as some justices on the court are hinting, that it's time for the insular cases to be relegated to history. Well, an overbroad statement. But what the case dealing with Puerto Rico is, the ratio or the point in controversy is whether the members of that board, that PROMESA board, are officers of the United States or officers of the territory of Puerto Rico. Because if they're officers of the United States, they have to be confirmed by Congress, and they weren't.
And that's what this whole kerfuffle is about?
That's what this case is about. Let me just take a break here because we've got the last break of the program coming up, and I'll be back and I'll explain here. Spend a little more time with the insular cases, which everybody wants to talk about, but no one wants to read.
Take Care Wellness presents the 7th Save the Susu Dance Fitness Fundraiser, October 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Teason High School. Tickets are $10 in advance, $15 the day of the event, and $5 for kids ages 6 to 12. Tickets are available at Take Care Wellness, Guam Cancer Care, and through Marissa Collins. Grand prize for the raffle is a round-trip ticket to Asia or Micronesia from United Airlines. All proceeds benefit Guam Cancer Care. This message is made possible by the stations of Choice Broadcasting.
Tall Tales with Bob Klitzkie is brought to you by Bank Pacific, banking on the Pacific for 65 years.
So here we are, Churchill Downs, Louisville, Kentucky. You just saw the horses herded into the starting gate. We are now heading down the home stretch at Tall Tales, which means that Daryl and I have got 8 minutes to wrap it up. And at the end of the program, I will make the ceremonial handoff for the change of command by giving my blue pencil to Daryl and leave it to him to criticize unmercifully the editorial policy of the Daily News. But we're talking off camera here about the insular cases and this Puerto Rico case. And the Puerto Rico case turns on whether or not the PROMESA board are officers of the United States. Because if they are, they have to be confirmed by Congress. If not, then they don't. And thinking since the insular cases has been that all of the provisions of the United States Constitution don't follow the flag to the territories. That's what one of the major points of the insular cases is about. You know, this whole thing about inferior races, et cetera, is BS, but it keeps getting repeated. The insular cases were the two big ones, Downs versus Bidwell and DeLima versus Bidwell, dealt with whether or not shippers had to pay tariffs on oranges and bananas. Mm-hmm. And the answer was no, because the uniformity clause of the U.S. Constitution didn't apply in those foreign territories. And that is the holding in the insular cases. So if the Supreme Court now looks at this PROMESA thing and says, yes, these guys really are officers of the United States, they must be confirmed by Congress, the actions of the PROMESA board may be void, and the PROMESA board won't be able to take any future action. So it's a potentially really important matter before the Supreme Court. Now, Neil Weir, among those closely watching the arguments, will be former Guam resident Neil Weir, president of Equally American, a nonprofit that seeks to advance equality. Well, whenever I see that word, I want to fasten my seatbelt. Equality and civil rights for nearly 4 million American citizens living in U.S. territories. So his outfit wants equality and civil rights for people living in the territories. Well, I'm about as equal here as I want to be. And as far as civil rights are concerned, I think we got them. Weir's organization has filed a friend of the court brief. And then here's a quote. The insular cases and the doctrine of territorial incorporation have been rightly criticized for creating a second-class status for residents of so-called unincorporated territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, based on the racist view, and this is wrong. And I've gone to some length showing that it's wrong, and Neil Weir knows that it's wrong, but demagoguery requires that you use the word race and racist whenever you can. Whether it has anything to do with what you're talking about has nothing to do with it. But let's just stop for a moment and ask what would happen if the Supreme Court said, yes, the insular cases were wrong and we're overruling the insular cases. What would happen? Well, checks would be sent out to all the residents of the U.S. territories, right? No.
No.
What would happen would be that all of the territories would become incorporated territories, as was Hawaii, Alaska, Wyoming, all of the western parts of the United States before there were states.
And even some of the islands that were claimed under the Guano Act, those have been incorporated. I think Johnston Island, there's a few.
Palmyra.
Palmyra.
Palmyra is the last incorporated territory because it was part of the incorporated territory of Hawaii. And when Hawaii was admitted, the admission legislation expressly excluded Palmyra. So Palmyra is the last incorporated territory of the U.S.
But it is incorporated.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't have any
Expressly.
doesn't have any people or government or anything else. But by God, it's incorporated.
But
so,
doesn't the Supreme Court, why would it want to legislate basically the status of the territories?
Well, and that's the point. You know, if anyone were to read the insular cases other than me, you know, people are so free to talk about the insular cases without reading them. They went by 5-4 decisions, and there was quite a division and scholarly thinking on both sides of the case. And at the turn of the last century, that was the big issue. Should the United States become an imperial power? It filled the newspapers. William Jennings Bryan was the populist who said, no, we're not an imperial country. We should not plop our flag over these far-flung islands, etc. William Jennings Bryan, by the way, was known as the boy orator of the Platte. And H.L. Mencken, the editor or an editorial writer for the Baltimore Sun, said, this is very appropriate. He is the boy orator of the Platte. He's like the Platte River, a mile wide and an inch deep at the mouth. But it was a hotly contested matter. So if Guam were an incorporated territory, the uniformity clause would apply, which would mean all U.S. tariff regulations would apply. I think we would lose our mirror image tax structure. We would be just like Hawaii and all of the western territories were before they were states. To me, this would be a huge step backwards.
There would even be no possibility of self-determination.
It would drive a wooden stake through the heart of self-determination.
Immediately.
Yeah, because as it is, an unincorporated territory under Article 4, Section 3, the United States can dispose, and the United States has disposed of the Philippine Islands as an independent country. But once we became incorporated, that would be the end. There would be no more independence. Well, anyhow, Daryl, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm presenting the coveted blue pencil to you, shaking hands, and as we say in showbiz, break a leg.
Well, thank you very much, Bob.
Okay, and you can
I'm going to miss you.
Make the closing remarks here today, Daryl. Go
No,
ahead.
this moment is yours.
Yeah, well,
I want to listen to you just as long as I can.
Well, I don't have anything to say actually, but that's never stopped me from talking before. So it's another exciting, educational, informative episode of Tall Tales. I'll see you next month. Daryl will see you tomorrow. Adios, todos hamzu.
The Point is KU.